Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Murray, President of the World Federation of the Deaf. I want to welcome you all to the first of our WFD 70th Anniversary webinar series. Each month during 2021, our 70th anniversary year, the WFD will be hosting a webinar on topics of interest to global deaf communities and our partners. This month, we are opening with a topic that has long been of special interest to deaf communities and to the WFD. And that topic is the education of deaf learners. Education has been a long-standing area of focus for the World Federation of the Deaf. Indeed, the founding Congress of the WFD in 1951 listed, quote, gathering data concerning education, assistance, and teaching, end quote, of deaf people and communicating scientific and practical information on deaf education as one of the primary purposes of the newly founded World Federation of the Deaf. And that attention to education has continued throughout the years. The WFD and our 127 ordinary members, representative national associations of deaf people in 127 countries across 6 continents, have long fought for the right of deaf children to have an education in their national sign languages. This is the background to WFD's decision to host this webinar today. Our title, The Journey Toward Inclusive Bilingual Sign Language Schools, will take us through some major changes that have taken place in our understanding of inclusive education and how it applies to deaf learners. It's important for us to tell you of these changes. So for today's webinar, we are pleased to have 4 panelists who will offer us a variety of perspectives on the topic of inclusive education for deaf people. I want to thank them for taking the time to share their insights on how to achieve meaningful and quality inclusive education for deaf learners. Our panelists are Dr. Kristen Snowden, Associate Professor at the School of Early Childhood Studies at Ryerson University and co-coordinator of the WFD Expert Group on Deaf Education. Hi, Kristen. We also have Dr. Sabaji Panda, Director of the Happy Hands School for the Deaf. In India. Welcome, Sabaji. Next, we'll have Mr. Akira Morita, Vice Principal at the Meisei Gaoken School for the Deaf in Japan. And the sign for the school is like this. Thank you. We also have with us Ms. Sue Swenson, the President of Inclusion International and member of the IDA Inclusive Education Task Team. Thank you, Sue. A little bit of practical information regarding languages and access to this meeting. For accessibility, we have subtitles, and today's languages will be International Sign and Spoken English. For the captions, you can see them below in the Zoom screen Or if you prefer, you can follow captions through stream text, and we'll post that link. Please follow our webinar on social media. It is being broadcast live on Facebook Live, and we are also posting on Twitter and Instagram from the World Federation of the Deaf accounts. The hashtags that you should use are hashtag WFD70, hashtag DeafEd, and hashtag inclusive education. And you'll see that below on screen. There are several points that we want to discuss this afternoon. First, the education of deaf people should be inclusive, must be inclusive. But what is meant by inclusive has not always been clear. The WFD sees that there are numerous definitions of inclusion at the local, national, and international levels, among deaf organizations and disabled people's organizations, among academics and professionals working in the education sector, and within governments. This is why the WFD, a founding member of the International Disability Alliance, joined the International Disability Alliance Education Flagship Initiative. This flagship is a component of a broader Catalyst project funded by DFID, which aims at framing the SDGs implementation from a CRPD and DPO perspective, while ensuring participation of the most marginalized groups. Importantly, this flagship provides the WFD and other members of the IDA the opportunity to come to a common understanding of what we mean by inclusive education, and to promote this common understanding through joint advocacy. Today, you will learn more about the IDA's Inclusive Education Global Report, which outlines the conditions required to build an inclusive education system geared toward providing quality education to all children and youth equitably. This report has a set of 10 recommendations to governments and civil society that are considered essential for the implementation of inclusive education for all learners, including children and youth with disabilities, and including deaf children. This report builds from the spirit and intent of each paragraph of CRPD Article 24. Now, Article 24 was the result of intense discussion during the CRPD drafting process, which resulted in cross-disability consensus. Likewise, this report shows a clear cross-disability consensus. The report is a result of many hours of discussion among IDA members. The outcome represents the unified view of the IDA's 8 global members and 6 regional networks, providing us with a way forward to achieving SDG 4 for all learners. Now, I want to highlight a few points from this report, which are of interest to deaf communities. First, we must move away from seeing deaf education as a part of special education. Deaf learners do not need special education or special education settings. What we do need are sign language settings as part of an inclusive education system. Inclusive education settings have been misunderstood as consisting of placements often placements in local schools. Research clearly shows that such placements of deaf children in local school settings without deaf peers and without access to teaching in the national sign languages do not provide meaningful education, let alone inclusive education. A major component of a successful education for deaf children is for them to be educated alongside others who use their national sign languages. There currently exist many schools for deaf learners around the world. As of today, not all of these schools can be considered inclusive sign language schools. There are 3 reasons for this. First, very few are truly bilingual or multilingual in their national languages, signed and spoken or written. The WFD has earlier estimated that less than 2% of deaf children have access to a truly multilingual education in their national sign languages. Regardless of the exact number, it is a fact that an exceedingly small percentage of deaf learners have access to teachers who sign fluently and are educated alongside deaf peers and role models. Second, while some schools for deaf people follow the national curriculum and provide a quality education, others are stuck in an outmoded special education mindset and deaf learners are not taught up to their full potential. This is wrong. Deaf children can succeed and must be given every opportunity to succeed. Deaf schools must provide a quality, inclusive education that meets national standards. Deaf education should not be of worse quality than the education given to other learners. Schools should be managed by the Ministry of Education and held to the same standards as all other schools in the country. Third, deaf schools should be inclusive of all learners. Inclusive means truly inclusive for all deaf learners. These schools must also be fully inclusive for deaf learners with disabilities, deaf children with cognitive and physical disabilities, including deaf children on the autism spectrum, deaf children with mobility disabilities, and deaf-blind or low-vision deaf children. They all have the same rights to access inclusive sign language schools. Deaf education must move beyond a special education model and must remove ableism in the provision of an education in national sign languages. So what do we do with the existing ecosystem of deaf schools and experts, often deaf themselves, who have invested in deaf education over the past 200 years? CRPD Article 24 makes it clear that deaf and deaf-blind children have the human right to an education with their peers and in environments that maximize their academic and social development. There is a principle called the standstill principle, which means government should not take action that would worsen human rights compared to what has already been in place. The closure of deaf schools and other spaces in which signing deaf children can congregate violates the standstill principle and thus the CRPD. The IDA Inclusive Education Global Report calls on governments to assist in the transition of existing deaf schools into inclusive bilingual sign language schools. These schools can and should be a part of a national system of inclusive education. We can and we must ensure quality education in national sign languages for all deaf children. And today, we're going to explain how exactly to do that by showing different different examples of how this happens around the world. And with this, I'd like to introduce our first presenter today, Dr. Kristen Snowden. Dr. Snowden is going to present some of the recommendations from the WFD Baseline Data Collection Report on Deaf Education in Nepal. Over to you, Dr. Snowden.
Thank you, Joe. Can we show my slides? Are they being shown? Okay, next slide, please. Yep, next slide. I did some research, approximately 7 months in 2014 in Nepal, and looking at the policies that they had established. I took 2 trips to Nepal, attended some of their deaf schools, looked at their local villages, went to the cities. And when I was there, I would see deaf children in contained classrooms in regular schools, in these classrooms called resource rooms. And maybe there would be about 22 students there. So I would meet with the deaf educators, I would meet with the deaf associations and have conversations with them. And I'd also speak with the non-deaf educators and head teachers and so forth. So I had conversations with these 2 different groups. Next slide, please. And what I really wanted to do was collect feedback, and in addition to the research that I was gathering, or as a part of the research that I was gathering. And I was very much focused on policy. And Nepal is beautiful, and their policy talks about freedom of education for deaf children. And, you know, the rest of the world thinks that that's true and they want the same. Now, actually going to Nepal and seeing what the situation is on the ground, I can say that it's not free. Parents of deaf children are having to pay for their children to attend school. If there's travel involved to get to the school, if it's not close to their home location, if the children have to stay at the school and sleep and live there, that becomes a problem as well in terms of funding. And there's really a lot of confusion in terms of what inclusive education means. The deaf schools have closed, and so they are insisting that deaf children be mainstreamed. And so again, the policy is not very clear in terms of what inclusive means, and that deaf children need sign language used in terms of their education. There needs to be a focus on teacher training. The reason for that is because in Nepal, they do have a Bachelor's of Education program in Kathmandu. So in Kathmandu, they have a teacher education program. However, it's not focused on bilingual education, so they don't emphasize sign language and written literacy. Most of the programs focus on teaching their future educators in the same way that they do for their non-deaf children. They don't talk about how to teach sign language or how to use sign language for teaching. So what we need is to have more teachers trained specifically to work with deaf children coming out of these programs. So in order to get a government license to be able to become a teacher, those have not been readily made available for deaf individuals who want to work as educators. The tests are not accommodated for deaf learners. So those who are teaching deaf people that are not deaf themselves and not sign language users themselves do need to learn Nepalese Sign Language. 75% of the teachers for the deaf in Nepal are not deaf themselves, and the majority of them don't know sign language fluently. They take a 2-week course, which is not sufficient to teach deaf children. So there needs to be an emphasis on furthering the Nepalese Sign Language instruction for teachers who are going to be working with deaf children. So the deaf children in Nepal going to school don't attend school until after 5 years of age. So before they're 5, there are no opportunities for education. They have something called ECD, which is early childhood development, but disabled children and deaf children aren't incorporated into that, so they don't have that opportunity. Also, parents have to be supported in their own acquisition of sign language. The deaf associations throughout Nepal do support parents in this, in terms of having sign language tutors going to the families' homes to teach them. But as you know, travel in Nepal is not always easy because of the mountainous environment. And in those places, I think that you could have a tutor going to the individual's homes, but where the terrain is more flat level and easier to travel around, you could have the parents coming together and learning in like a classroom environment. So I went to see these children in the resource room, and what I found there was that the older deaf children were teaching the younger deaf children in these resource classrooms, while the teacher that was in the room didn't know sign at all. As you may or may not know, in Nepal, a lot of children aren't attending school at various ages. So this needs to be rectified as well. There needs to be an emphasis on going to school, but then also on the written language literacy skills. So when I was there, had a lot of interactions with people of various ages. And when I interacted with the high school level students and we emphasized in our discussion about literacy skills being taught specifically for that age group, that they really needed to have that. The other thing that's lacking from the education there, the system, is having sign language interpreters. So that also needs to be included, and the government should be responsible for providing that service. Also bilingual education and the curriculum, which needs to mention bilingual education, and any other programs or projects. And really the teachers need further training. So to see the full report that I've written, the links are here. They are in both accessible in English and Nepalese. So in summary, I went to Nepal. I saw their deaf schools and teachers, the associations. I saw a lot of collaboration. They have the laws. But what they do need more of is resources and support to further their cause. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen. When we talk about deaf education as for quality education, we can find this all over the world. So I'd like to thank you again for engaging in that research. You can find more information, as Kristen said, in those links or on the WFD website. I would now like to invite Sue Swenson, President of Inclusion International, and my colleague on the IDA board. As an example of the spirit of this collaborative effort, I want to note that President Svensson's participation in this webinar is likely a historic first. This is the first time Inclusion International has been present at an event on inclusive education hosted by the WFD. And this follows up from an earlier first when I was myself invited to participate in Inclusion International's webinar on inclusive education in December of last year. President Svensson will present the IDA report on inclusive education and its recommendations. Sue?
Thank you so much, Joe. I'm very glad to be here and a little bit scared. I have to admit that. I have spent a lot of time as a federal appointee in special education and working with various populations and civil society of people with disabilities. And it's always difficult when we are working with ideals to realize that we have to move to thinking about what are the issues between us, what are the difficulties yet to be resolved, what are the difficulties that emerge from our success, and what are the mistakes that governments are making and that, frankly, that civil society is making as we move forward to try to achieve these ideals. The International Disability Alliance report on inclusive education was developed with multiple expert and community consultations in the years between 2018 and 2020. The final report was issued in March of 2020. I was asked today to cover the rationale of the report and the final recommendations for the World Federation of the Deaf as you work toward the achievement of inclusive bilingual sign language schools. The Global Report on Inclusive Education presents the work and views of the International Disability Alliance on, first, how to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, in compliance with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and especially respecting its Article 24 on the rights of all learners with disabilities. The report is based on a consensus position developed by IDA members on strategic orientations that must guide the reform of the education sector, presenting a commonly agreed cross-disability perspective, which hopefully can inform disability rights advocacy in the area of education, all of our advocacy. The rationale for the report is well identified, and it is as follows. Inclusive education is the only way to achieve SDG 4 for all children, including children with disabilities, no matter who or where they are. Inclusion is not a placement, but rather an experience with a sense of belonging. Inclusive education requires an educational transformation with accessibility to enable full participation. It is not an add-on to existing education systems. In an inclusive education system, all learners with and without disabilities learn together with their peers in classes in their local community schools. They all receive the support they need from preschool to tertiary and vocational education in inclusive and accessible schools that are responsive to cultural and community values, to evidence and best practices, and to individual preferences. An inclusive education system is geared towards providing quality education to all children and youth equitably. An inclusive education system has the following characteristics. All education facilities are regulated by the age and content appropriate ministries of education. Non-discrimination and zero reject policies are implemented and enforced. Provision of reasonable accommodation is defined in the CRPD as enforced at all levels and everywhere. Significant investments are made in recruiting and training qualified teachers, including teachers with disabilities. Teacher education and curriculum reforms incorporate universal design for learning. Significant investments are made in accessibility for teachers, students, and parents. Well-resourced support services are available at all levels to assist teachers in meeting the needs of students with disabilities. A diversity of languages, such as sign language and tactile sign language, and modes of communication, such as easy read and braille, are used throughout the system, with priority given to fluent teachers and support given for development of fluency. Special schools and segregated settings are progressively phased out, while key human resources and knowledge are allowed to become support services in inclusive settings. Existing schools for students who are deaf that do not use sign language or follow government curricula are converted into inclusive bilingual sign language schools. Data are collected, disaggregated by disability, and analyses are performed to promote monitoring and resourcing of equitable, inclusive schools. Decentralized systems ensure consistent regulations, monitoring, and resource allocation at all levels. Multi-stakeholder engagement is promoted and supported, including supports to stakeholders with disabilities. Support services are linked with the education system to promote independent living, starting with early learning. Now, the recommendations to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 4, that is, to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, in compliance with the CRPD, it is imperative that one common understanding of inclusive education be reached. One ideal. In this regard, IDA welcomes UNESCO's 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, which emphasizes learner diversity not as a problem, but as an opportunity. IDA endorses the GEM report's key recommendations. Toward the goal of achieving one common understanding of inclusive education, and speaking as an authoritative voice of the disability rights movement at the global level, IDA promotes this important ideal. In an inclusive education system, all learners with and without disabilities learn together in classes in their community schools. They receive the support they need from preschool, primary and secondary education to tertiary and vocational education in inclusive and accessible schools. Some learners, both with and without disabilities, may choose to attend schools outside their local communities in order to benefit from quality bilingual sign language schools, to acquire specific skills and knowledge, or to get specific support that is not yet available in their community schools. These settings must also be inclusive. The renewed commitment to inclusive education in SDG 4 requires a combined effort of all stakeholders speaking with one voice. The recommendations below are those that IDA deems essential and urgent to the implementation of inclusive education for all learners, including children, youth, and adult learners with disabilities. IDA's recommendations to governments are as follows. 1, whether managed by the public or private sectors, all education facilities must be regulated by ministries of education or relevant ministries for inclusive vocational training, early childhood development, and lifelong learning. 2, non-discrimination policies, zero rejection policies, and reasonable accommodations, as defined in the CRPD, must be enforced across the country and at all levels of the system. 3, significant investments, human, social, and financial, must be made in recruiting and training qualified teachers, including teachers with disabilities, who can provide inclusive and quality learning for all learners, ensuring accessibility of all education facilities, teaching and learning materials, curricular and extracurricular activities, providing assistive products and technology and the training thereof, and ensuring support services at all levels, including engaging parents and the community to assist all schools in providing quality and inclusive learning for all. 4, teacher education and curriculum reforms must foster the principles of universal design for learning, including equal access and participation in learning and assessment. Ministries of education must engage in the planning, design, and implementation of a single, flexible national curriculum that recognizes the diversity of the country and encourages an individualized learning approach that is fit for purpose. 5, a diversity of languages, including national sign language and tactile sign languages, and modes of communication must be used throughout the system with teachers who have full fluency. 6, data must be consistently collected, disaggregated to the extent possible by disability type, and analyzed to ensure adequate monitoring and resourcing of inclusive and equitable quality education. 7, in decentralized systems, a consistent set of regulations, accountability mechanisms, and resource planning for inclusive education at the different levels of government must be ensured. And finally, number 8, communities, families, parents, and students themselves must be active participants in monitoring and evaluation activities. Education reform with a view to equitable participation requires governments and professionals to actively engage at the community level in order to determine the strengths of each community and their preferences. Meaningful consultation and engagement with communities, families, and parents is essential to the fruitful realization of SDG 4. IDA's recommendations to civil society are only 2, but they are pretty significant. First, organizations of persons with disabilities must assume new roles within communities, schools, and systems, and become advisors and professional experts in specific disabilities. They will become mentors and role models to children and youth with disabilities. All OPDs have a role to play in policy development, accessibility advisory, effective implementation, teacher preparation, parent support, providing psychosocial support, and so on. Persons with disabilities and their families are the best placed advisors for a system transformation that places children and youth with disabilities and CRPD commitments at the core of reform. And the second recommendation for civil society is donors and external funding sources to INGOs comply with SDG 4 and the CRPD by making all available funds contingent on disability inclusive provisions. In addition, governments ensure all INGOs have an opportunity to actively and purposefully engage in reform efforts, but continue leading in the provision of adequate and inclusive services. All INGOs must pledge their support to the design and implementation of inclusive education systems. So a lot of work for civil society, a lot of work for government. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks so much, Sue. And you're right, there is a lot of responsibility that's being placed on civil society, and that's the real challenge. And we have to live up to that challenge. Our next panelist, I'd like us to say hello to Akira Morita. the vice principal of the Meisei Gakuen School for the Deaf in Japan. Now, we do have a video as a part of Mr. Morita's presentation. If we could cue that up, please. Hello, I am here as a representative of the Meisei Gakuen School for the Deaf in Japan. Most schools for the deaf in Japan are oral, but ours is different. It's a sign language school where we focus on Japanese Sign Language and written Japanese. The school was established in 2008. And this was after years of lobbying the government that we needed a sign language school. Now, 2017, we welcomed some of the little ones, deaf children from ages 0 to 2. Now, the foundation of our school is Japanese Sign Language. It is because we have all of our lessons, all of our subjects in Japanese Sign Language that our school succeeds. Without Japanese Sign Language as the main language of instruction, we would not have the success that we have. Now we have 63 children in our school. And I would now like to show you a short clip of our 3 to 5-year-olds interacting in the library. How come it swims like this? What is oyatu? Ah, snack. Looking at pictures of ghosts and being scared. Ooh, scary. I think it is cut off below the neck. Me too. I got it. It just has the head out. What's this? It's a bird-like fish. It glides like this. Baby dragonflies and dragonflies are so different, aren't they? I've seen a baby dragonfly. So in that short clip, you can see how rich the sign language environment is for our young ones. We have, of course, some research that backs up the way that we teach our students. And this is some poetry from our students in sign language. So they're asking why tears are like the ocean, because they're also salty. How can one make the ocean? People can make tears. When you cry with so much regret, it becomes an ocean. Very good. So in drama, there are scenes when people cry, but the expression of true suffering, things that are unforgettable, that might be like an ocean. Ocean represents eternity. That is why the ocean contains many dreams. Say, for example, someone wants to become a teacher, and when it doesn't come true, she will cry. Tears of regret certainly contain dreams. So you can see in sign language, we can represent poetry and we can talk about subjects that are deep and philosophical. Now we're going to look at a clip about the partial solar eclipse. What day is Sunday, June 21st? Father's Day. There is something else that happens other than Father's Day. The moon, maybe there was something on the newspaper. The sun becomes a golden ring. Oh, the golden ring. Well, we'll need our sunglasses. Between 4 and 6 o'clock on June 21st, we can see the partial eclipse of the sun in everywhere over Japan. When the moon crosses between the sun and the earth, the sun looks like a crescent, right? When the sun and moon overlap, we can see the golden ring. Unfortunately, we can't see the golden ring. It is called the partial solar eclipse. They don't overlap fully, so only a part of the sun will be missing. So you can see this is another example of a scientific discussion happening in Japanese Sign Language. Now our 12-year-olds start their English class, which you'll see here. Why a cat has A and eraser has an E. Is A used for animals only? With things? Perhaps an is for things without life and A is for things with life. When you pronounce just A, it's difficult to distinguish. From the following word with an it's easier to distinguish. Is A used with humans? So the teacher is now explaining. I got it. With words starting with vowels, it's difficult to pronounce after an A. So you add an N when words start with a vowel. So here is a video that the children made themselves called The Pride of Meisei Gakuen. Good morning. The Pride of Meisei Gakuen. Let's go and look for them. Deaf identity. What is deaf identity? In order to join the society with pride, you need to have deaf identity. The enrollment ceremony, sports day, school festival, graduation ceremony, jump rope dance, sign poem for numbers 1 to 10. 1, children are walking. 2, they see eye to eye. 3, many teachers and children. 4, they greet each other. 5, Meisei Gakuen. When you open the door, 6, children are singing. 7, and chatting away. 8, we study. 9, and increase knowledge. We are happy. 10, there are birds flying in the sky. How do you like the dance and the poem? There is something we'd like you to know. There is no music class in Meisei, so you may think it is difficult for us to learn rhythm. It's okay. We have sign poems and dance full of rhythm. Deaf people can do anything except hear. In Meisei, you can study what will be really useful to you in the future. It is a very nice surrounding. We all have sign language as our first language. It is easier to learn Japanese after we have good Japanese sign language. There are so many good things in Meisei Gakuen. So come and join us. Bye. Some bloopers. So deaf identity is indeed important. With all the hearing people in the world, deaf people need to be strong to live within hearing societies, and a deaf identity helps them to be strong. We need to start instilling this into our deaf children at a very early age. Thank you. Wow. What a moving, moving video. I think we were all very, very inspired to see how truly bilingual and truly inclusive schools can be so successful. A few years ago, I personally had the honor of going to visit your school, and it was so special for me to play games with the children and see them succeed. I now want to introduce our next panelist, who is also showing a model of a deaf school in rural India. Dr. Panda will share the story of the establishment of this school and what makes it an inclusive bilingual school. Dr. Sibaji Panda, director of the Happy Hands School for the Deaf. Over to you, Sibaji. Hello, everyone. Hello, all the deaf people and the hearing people all over the world who are watching this webinar. As the director of the Happy Hands School for the Deaf, I am very pleased to congratulate the WFD for completing 70 years and supporting deaf people for full human rights globally. I will talk about our school, our inclusive and scientific approaches to education, the journey of setting up this school and being a bit different and being in the limelight in such a short period of time. Now, I want everyone, including the WFD, to understand that we are not taking a step back. We are improving and moving forward. My name is Sibaji Panda. I am the director of the Happy Hands School for the Deaf. And the sign for our school looks like this. Today, I'll give you a little bit of the story of how we became an inclusive bilingual school for the deaf. And this is the short version. So as Joseph mentioned, we are in India. We're in the eastern part of the country, in a small village. It's not very developed. It's considered rural India. So the school is there. Now, before it was established, I worked at UCLan, a university in the United Kingdom, at an international Department of Sign Language Studies. Now, after leaving the university, I thought of establishing a school for the deaf. I had experienced life and travel in Europe and in America. I had been to the New Mexico School for the Deaf and stayed for 2 weeks. I observed what the environment was like there and what the environment was in other parts of the world at schools for the deaf. And I wasn't completely satisfied. So I decided to take it upon myself to do this work. Now in India, we have a complicated hierarchy of government departments and levels of approval in terms of education. I entered one of these committees and worked for 10 years tirelessly to try to make this change. 10 years ago, sign language was not even on the radar of any government department. And I fought very hard to make sure they realized that sign language needed to go hand in hand with education of deaf children. I had the knowledge, but I didn't know how exactly that would be passed on. The important thing to remember here is that we have 5 staff working at the school, and they're all deaf. Now, my partner who runs the school with me is also deaf. We now have 32 children from low economic backgrounds. Many of their parents are illiterate. Many of the families don't even have a phone or a mobile phone between them. All of the children sleep, eat, and study at the school, and it's completely free. It's a boarding school because they do not have the possibility of any support in sign language in their home environments. The reason that our school is unique and important is that we, in the 4 years that we have existed, we have had an incredible amount of attention on social media and from other stakeholders. And I'll explain a little bit why we got all this attention. So from a linguistic point of view, if deaf children do not have access to sign language before age 4, 5, or 6, then they are perpetually behind. They need to have a sign language instilled in them as a natural first language. And when the children first arrive at the school, they may feel a bit nervous, but within 1 or 2 days, they are already deep and swimming in a sign language environment, becoming more comfortable. We have knowledge, research, projects, and new ideas of how we can improve the school. We have an international institution for sign language and deaf studies, which we collaborate with, and they conduct research on how deaf children learn. So we don't necessarily teach at the school because teaching comes from the outside. We look at it from the children's perspective. We think about how they learn and focus on that. And that's where the research is directed. Now, everyone is used to having a fixed school curriculum, and that's something that you don't deviate from. At the Happy Hands School, the teachers, who are again all deaf, were brought into the school without any training. I have trained the teachers to look at the children and focus on them for a reverse curriculum. So what we do is we extract our curriculum from the students and from the ways that they grow. And this methodology has been very, very successful so far. So we have a game where we have games. So we learn through games, and this happens in teaching environments a lot. And a lot of these games are quite predictable, I would say, and not so exciting. What we do is we allow the children to play the games and to make them their own. And we involve them in different subjects such as English. It's transdisciplinary. So it's a mix of different subjects that go into one lesson, and the children learn the things that they're most interested in. The most important thing for us is literacy, of course. Deaf people are known to have struggled for their literacy achievements. Now, we have research that shows younger children are able to read and write and communicate very, very fluently as long as they have this support. And this is really the main stepping stone of their education. So we make sure that they're supported in the right ways to achieve literacy. Our school is truly, fully inclusive. And I know the word inclusive has long since tried to find the right definition, especially in law. The way that the word inclusion has been passed along through different discussions of standards has made it misunderstood. All children should not be taught the same things and in the same way. And this is not an easy thing to explain to people who are developing national curriculums, for example. Putting deaf and blind children together, and I know there are many schools for the deaf and blind, it doesn't make as much sense. But if you have this policy of inclusion and the right philosophy behind it, without forcing the same subjects in the same manner on every single student, no matter what their profile, that's not going to work. We need to look at the individual student and see how they learn and give them the gift of teaching. And this is what's ultimately the most important thing. I feel that our school is a truly inclusive and full sign language school. So, as we know, the word inclusion has a lot of different perspectives put upon it. There are schools for the deaf in India, which are bigger schools for the deaf. And I'm an advisor in two of the biggest schools. One of the schools has a couple of thousand students. And in that way, I feel it is just too big. There's no way you can control how the children are learning based on their individual needs. And so the model of what a sign language school looks like needs to change in my eyes. I hope that you have understood my message here. If you would like some more information, please look at the Happy Hands School for the Deaf on Facebook, where you will find a large collection of information and videos. With that, I thank you for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Panda. Quite interesting that we saw the School for the Deaf in Japan, India, and Nepal, different parts of the world, showing positive developments, although different. Now, I'm excited to bring together the directors of the schools for the deaf that we have here today, and to ask them what perhaps they could learn from each other. So Sibaji and Akira, can I invite you back? Okay, so what have you learned? Thank you very much, Sibaji, first of all, for your presentation. And it's so interesting how you support deaf children, especially those who come from rural and poor backgrounds. And of course, sign language is the foundation. Without sign language, none of what we do could be possible. As hearing children, you are born with hearing, and you start hearing 24 hours a day, all the time, whatever noise is happening around you, the television. And so you are like a sponge with your ears. As a deaf person, you don't have that ability with sound. And so therefore it switches to that same ability with your eyes, and signing is the tool that allows that expression to happen. And it tends to be in schools where that expression is fostered the most. So I'm very happy to have watched your presentation, Dr. Panda. Dr. Panda, what is your own perspective on this question? Thank you very much for the question. I was likewise very interested in your presentation. Most of us don't have a lot of resources, right? We don't even have any desks or computers or anything like that, right? Obviously, we have a small library of books that we depend on, but your school, for me, looked like something that was, in the future, you have so much to draw from in terms of resources. And I think what's important is that education continues to be resourced. And to be supported in that way. We need the building blocks, the things that every school has, like desks and computers and books, things that I don't have a lot of at the moment, but I see us in a few years having those resources. And it's inspiring to see that, right? So we are, our school goes up to age 11. We start at age 3. And after age 11, the children have to move to another school or learn on their own. And we can't accept children above the age of 11 for right now, for reasons that we can't accommodate them. So resources is a big one for me. Also, having deaf adults as role models for the children in school to pass down that culture and identity. At our school, we have teachers and children communicating in sign language. The culture and identity sometimes tends to be different, not completely different. But what I see in your school is perhaps the future of what we can provide in India. And I really think you are indeed a global role model. Thank you very much. And Joe is saying thank you to you both. Wow, this has been an incredible hour of sharing and learning. And it's important for us to come together to look at inclusive education for all and to see what a fully inclusive sign language education looks like. We've seen great examples from Nepal, India, and Japan. This is something that is not an impossibility. There are some challenges, but we are clearly learning that inclusive education and bilingual sign language education schools can exist and can be provided for every deaf child around the world. And the way this can happen is for us to work together. At the World Federation of the Deaf, we have called upon governments to fully commit to their obligation to ensure quality, inclusive education for all deaf learners. These environments must have, at a minimum, congregated settings where deaf children and other children who use sign languages are able to learn alongside each other. Trained and qualified teachers who are fully fluent in their national languages, including teachers who are deaf. I invite you to see WFD's position paper on inclusive education and our position paper on the language rights of deaf children for more information on how to achieve meaningful, quality, inclusive education for deaf children. With that, I will close the webinar with this message. To deaf organizations who are watching, we have a job to do. The WFD's successful collaboration with other international disability organizations can and should be replicated in your countries. The IDA Global Report clearly supports what we have been fighting for many years, a clarification of inclusive education that puts deaf children's language rights at the center of the educational experience. Use this report and WFD's other materials to build a consensus among DPOs in your countries. It is incumbent upon us to hold existing schools and educational settings for deaf children accountable. We need to work together with governments to ensure every school setting for deaf children, whether deaf schools or large programs or twin schools, every educational setting must offer fully inclusive, quality, multilingual education. Deaf children deserve equal access to meaningful quality education and the chance at the equal opportunities in life that arise from a linguistically appropriate quality education. The WFD is here to support you. We have tools on our website ready for you to use in your national level advocacy. Now let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Thank you. Thanks again to all of our panelists, and thanks to all of you who have joined us today. Be sure to watch for our next webinar in our webinar series in February. Look at our social media channels for more information. Thank you.